Great. So, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our session this afternoon. We're really excited to get going and to talk to you all. I'm Kate. I'm from the partnerships team. Um, and Hannah will be leading. I'm just here to welcome. If you have any questions as you go along, please feel free to pop them in the chat. If I can answer them, I definitely will. If not, what I'll do is I'll just read them out to Hannah and she'll be able to answer them much better than me anyway. So yes, I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to turn my camera off, but I am still going to be here because I want all of the attention on Hannah and the slides that she's going to be sharing. So off you go.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kate. Oh, there we go. So in today's webinar, we're going to introduce, welcome to our webinar on how to support students with SEND in geography. We've already seen from those of you who posted in the chat that the gap between SEND and non-SEND in our schools is of concern and something that we all want to address. So hopefully by today, we'll look at this particularly through the lens of geography, and hopefully there'll be some practical strategies that we'll take away. So in terms of our agenda today, we're going to introduce who we are as ARC and ARC Curriculum Plus. We're going to explore the scale of the issue of SEND in geography. We're going to discuss what inclusion first teaching is and what this means for geography. We'll then explore what this looks like in geography in terms of curriculum design. And then before seeing some video footage of a classroom practice for a Year 7 lesson so we can see it in practice as well. At any point, please do post questions and we'll do our best to answer them. So who we are. Let's start with a bit of an introduction as to who we are and why we are well placed to support you in your thinking. So I'm Hannah, Head of Subject for Geography Mastery, leading on the design and vision for the programme and coaching HODs in many of our partner schools. I've also been teaching for 15 years and most recently was subject lead at one of our ARC schools where I developed a bit of a specialism in teaching our nurture groups in geography. So some of the work I'll share with you today is based on that work in one of our ARC schools. At ARC, we believe that all students, regardless of their background, are entitled to a great education and to make real choices in life. And it's really what drives us, our thinking and our decisions. As a network, we've got 39 schools across the Midlands and South East England and soon to be York as well. Most of our schools have significant levels of disadvantage, including high levels of SEND and EAL needs. So despite these challenges, many of our schools have above average Progress 8 scores. And within that, we are ARC Curriculum Plus, which is a venture that's developed within the ARC schools. And we're an organisation that exists to empower teachers to give every young person the subject knowledge and skills to succeed. We do this by providing curriculum resources, but also going into schools and offering support and training. So we're really up to date with the issues that matter the most to teachers. Geography Mastery is one of the newest programs of ARC Curriculum Plus, and we partner with over 70 schools, visiting them in person and providing with resources and CPD. So we're really acutely aware of what's in the mind of our geography teachers and leaders. And on the map, you'll see the real breadth of schools that we're working with very much across the country. So let's turn to our focus for the evening, SEND in geography. I want to start by reading out this quote from American educational psychologist Thomas Armstrong. Neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment? How absurd would it be to label a calla lily as having a petal deficit disorder, or to diagnose a person from Holland as suffering from altitude deprivation syndrome? There's no normal flower or culture, and similarly, we ought to accept the fact that there is no normal brain or mind. So I wonder how each of us relates to this quote. I find it really helpful to shift this. The quote helps to shift my perspective from this idea of neurodiversity being part of the norm. It's normal to make reasonable adjustments to accommodate everyone, and it's normal to think a bit differently. So we know that our students with SEND should be every bit as included as everybody else. But unfortunately, the data tells us a very different story, and those of us in the chat have already related to some of these differences. So have a look at the data on the slide. Note the key, which shows that the line with the diamond data points is showing our students with SEND. It's a bit of a depressing story here because we can see from the chart that the SEND students with SEND have attainment scores that are more than 20 percentage points lower than their mainstream peers at Key Stage 4. That's a really shocking gap. And sadly, a similar gap is also true at Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. The gap is not just academic. SEND creates a gap in other areas of pastoral concern also, including persistent absence, permanent exclusions, those not in employment or education, and lower well-being as well. And of course, we know if students are absent or excluded, this impacts how much learning they are doing. And lastly, it's quite upsetting to hear that students with SEND report lower sense of well-being than their peers. If nothing else, school needs to be a place where students feel confident and secure. So these are big issues to contend with. So how does this impact us in geography? Firstly, there is a perception held by many students, parents, and some teachers that geography is often easier. Often this misconception stems from the fact that essays in geography are shorter than in other humanities subjects, such as history, and this often means that LPA students, lower prior attaining students, or students with SEND are steered towards selecting geography as an easy option for humanities at Key Stage 4. And then these students become quite demotivated when they realise, well, it's actually quite tough. So let's explore why geography is really quite hard. So firstly, we have this idea of wide breadth. Students are required to master a wide range of knowledge from students' perspective, sometimes seemingly disparate topics. There are many place details to know and to recall, and accompanying this is a wide technical vocabulary. Students need to be good at literacy, but also their spatial literacy in terms of their geographical skills, how to read maps and charts and complex diagrams of information. Often students have to apply their knowledge and examples to new contexts and unseen stimuli, particularly in our Key Stage 4 exams. We know that fieldwork is quite hard to grasp for most of us and really requires high degree of social skills to work in groups that we don't do very often in our secondary education in general. Lastly, we are going to come on to the importance of strong teaching as a SEND approach in a moment, and we have a known issue with non-specialist teaching in geography. Often this non-specialist teaching is then funneled down to Key Stage 3, just when students are building the foundations to the discipline, and sometimes this results in reducing geography in the timetable as well. So something else to mention too. If you relate to any of these issues in particular, please maybe post in the chats. Maybe just take a moment. Are there any that really speak to you here that you noticed in geography is a particular issue for students with SEND in your context? And Kate, feel free to share if you pick up any. So at ARC, we know that students with disadvantage, including those with SEND, perform better compared to the national average. So that's why I'm excited to share with you a bit more about what we do. I'll just pause in case anyone's got any questions so far, Kate, or any questions in the chat or any reflections.
Nothing so far.
No worries. Brilliant. So let's move on. Okay, so how do we do it? How can we support our students with SEND to have a better and more successful experience at school and in geography? The DfE has recently released its white paper, All Children Achieving and Thriving, which has brought the issue of SEND to the national conversation. The paper addresses a huge range of issues, and I'll drill down to one aspect that really speaks to our work. It quotes, all children should experience a curriculum that is knowledge-rich, broad, inclusive, and innovative. The national curriculum should raise the floor for all, without adding any limit to ambition or achievement. I like this idea of having a strong curriculum that's accessible to all without limits. The question is, well, how do we do it? The works of Peps McRae at StetLab is very useful to us. He raises this point about cognitive similarity. This is the idea that as humans, the way our brains work are more similar than they are different. Now, this doesn't mean that SEND doesn't exist. What it means is that the core work that sits behind impactful SEND support is the same work that sits behind great teaching. To put it more plainly, if I didn't teach a lesson particularly well, my non-SEND students might get away with it and learn something, but my SEND students are most likely to suffer and come out with next to nothing from the lesson. So how can we use this work from Peps McRae and how does this help us to inform some principles behind inclusion-first teaching? So I've selected 3 that are useful for us as leaders of geography today. They are 1, specify the core knowledge, 2, teach complex knowledge accessibly, and 3, scaffold for independence. We'll discuss each in turn, and I'll show you each principle within curriculum design first and lesson planning, and then we'll move on to exploring how each principle works live in the classroom using this video of a Year 7 lesson. So let's talk about design and curriculum planning. I'll read this quote from our own ARC Inclusion First Guide. It's gaps in prior knowledge that most often limit progress for vulnerable students, and therefore we need clear progression which explicitly sets out the prerequisite knowledge and the core knowledge that students will need to take forward. So we know from our work that a key limiting factor for students is not how complex the new idea is in and of itself, but rather it's whether students have had the prior knowledge that's helped them to incorporate this new idea into their existing understanding, into their existing schema. I'll share a non-geography example to illustrate this idea. So this comes from a study in the Journal of Reading back in the 80s, but still relevant today. In the study, 2 participant groups were shown this text that you can see in yellow on the board. One group was shown the text straight away, and the other group was shown an image before they started this reading, and that image was a clue. Have a read of the text yourself, as if you were part of the first group that just saw this text. I'll give you it needs a little while to read this, so I'll give you a few seconds there. Would anyone like to make a guess of what this is about? I couldn't guess it myself. Kate, do shout if anyone's been bold enough to make a guess.
Will do. Nobody bold enough just yet.
What about yourself, Kate?
Don't pick on me, please.
So I was completely stumped by this, right? It doesn't make a huge amount of sense, does it? So let's take a look at the secret clue that Group B was shown. Aha, laundry. Now have a read of the text again. It's written in sort of unnecessarily complex speak, but it will start to make a little more sense now that we've seen this context of the laundry basket. So that was the study, and what they found from the studies that Group B were able to say, oh, this does make sense, I do understand it, and Group A remained completely flummoxed and couldn't make any sense of what the text meant. So in that study, they used it to conclude, right, if we have the prerequisite knowledge, then that helps us to make sense of the text. It's not just about the complexity of the words, but it's about our prior knowledge and how this informs us. So too in geography, if we have context to what we are learning about, we can start to make more sense of what's being said. Those who may have had the relevant prior knowledge are, of course, at the greatest advantage. So let's turn to an example in geography. In all of our geography mastery lessons, the core knowledge of the lesson is whittled down to around 4 to 6 bullet points. And these are the core pieces of knowledge and understanding that we want students to retain. Now, this doesn't mean that the lesson becomes rote learning of these bullet points and lacks discussion or analysis or creative thought. It's more of a steering guide for the teacher of what knowledge to prioritize and stops the lesson going off track. Have a read of the lesson here, because when I show the video in a probably about 10 minutes time, it's going to relate to this particular lesson.
Just while people are reading now, don't want to cognitive overload anybody. But somebody, Benny has written in the chat about dual coding as well.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really important part of it, and we'll come on to that. That's absolutely true. Okay. For those of us really on top of our geography, we'll actually know that some of these income thresholds have changed, but the video I show you is back from December 24 when these were the categories. So we can see some of these key ideas that we want students to know in the lesson. Sometimes this still feels a bit much when we're teaching students with SEND. So what I say to teachers in this context is, imagine a particular student in your class that you can think of, and imagine that student went home and said, well, Mum or Dad, today in geography I learned da, 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 da. Well, how would you like them to finish that sentence? Try to keep it to 2 or 3 ideas and write it down now. So teachers tend to be able to do this quite well, and they find it helps them really reflect. Here's an example I've just put on the board thinking of a particular student in my class. You'll see how it links to the core knowledge above very directly. It's not omitting any key idea or shying away from complex concepts. It's just putting it together in an accessible way. This, what we will have learned passage, will then stick in teachers' mind as they teach. And you can write multiple versions of this for different students you have in mind, which gives you a kind of real perspective on the lesson that you're about to go into. So this is part of our first principle, specifying the core knowledge. Now let's look at how this builds over time. If we sequence carefully in one lesson, we also build up knowledge that then becomes the prior knowledge for the next lesson and the next lesson. And then that makes knowledge more accessible over time. And then we can see that over time, this is going to reduce the attainment gap. So if we look at our Year 7 lesson that we just read about, looking at examples of wealth around the world, we'll see that secure knowledge of these 3 income categories, high, middle, and low income countries, later will enable students to do more complex things with characteristics of HICs and LICs. For example, in a subsequent lesson, they learn, when they're learning about manufacturing, that HICs typically buy lots of manufactured goods from middle-income countries and then sell them to consumers. So this underlines the importance of careful sequencing, both within and between lessons. The more clarity we have of our core knowledge, the more able we are to do this well and bring our lessons to life and support that closing of those attainment gaps. Our second principle. So teach complex knowledge accessibly. Sounds a bit like an oxymoron. But what I mean by this, it's our job to make that complexity easier to understand, as we're all entitled to grasp it. When we do that, we're being great teachers. So in Geography Mastery, we think about how our resources make it easier for teachers to communicate complex ideas simply. And I know one of our participants just now has mentioned this idea of dual coding, and you'll see an example of that on the board. A range of icons that help communicate this idea of quality of life. You'll see the slide is quite sparse. There's very little text written, and I might also animate the slide only to show one aspect at a time to reduce cognitive load. Here's another example where we use analogies to explain the structure of the Earth, quite commonly done, but having those side by side can really help students to map on those 2 ideas together. Again, very sparse slide, mostly images, maybe 1 sentence, and then it's on the teacher to really think about that kind of exposition, or perhaps if they've got the diagram in front of the student, how the student might be annotating that diagram to show an understanding. Here's another aspect we could look at is the importance of literacy in geography. There's very high technical vocabulary in geography and a wide range of ideas to explain. In this third example, visuals are used alongside short text to explain a range of factors. We use glossaries in every lesson to support the teaching of vocabulary and are specific to each lesson. And this is pre-taught often at the beginning of a lesson, and I'll show you some examples of that in due course. There's often a belief, unfortunately, that it isn't worthwhile to pursue literacy with students in LPA groups or students with SEND, because it's much easier if the teacher just explains it. But although great teacher exposition is an important component, I really do believe there's also scope for improving literacy in the classroom, with text right in front of students, not just 10 foot away on the board. And our evidence suggests that reading geography for SEND is all the more important. I'll summarise now how we can support reading with SEND, so with students with SEND, so you can consider how it might work in practice in your context. The first step is for the teacher to pre-select the text. This could be as short as 4 to 5 sentences. See what I've included in the yellow box on the board. The second step is to mark up the text in advance for the teacher to do this, highlighting words you want students to focus on and jotting down where you will add your own exposition or where you want students to annotate under your guidance. You'll see in my example, particularly with the definition of disease, that I'm less focused on a technically accurate definition, but more what's the minimal understanding needed for students to make progress in the paragraph. Thirdly, we can write down questions that we want students to answer by highlighting. So we might say, when I say go, highlight the answer to this question. And this technique helps us to check that all students have understood the text. So what is the benefit of using a vaccine? That is something that students can directly highlight in the text, demonstrating their understanding. The teacher would walk around the room and notice that all students have highlighted the text in the same way. If they haven't, they'll go back and make sure they've explained it as well. These are quite, at this stage, quite simple questions, very much comprehension questions. It's just texting, and that's just assessing for meaning in the text. I find in this context of this accountable independent reading, it's often called, it's usually best for the teacher to read aloud, as the key purpose is for students to have the opportunity to hear text read fluently so they can focus on its meaning. And other kinds of techniques in different contexts will focus on student fluency. But this one is very much focused on students interpreting the meaning of the text. Key principle 3. So our third principle is scaffold for independence. There's also often a misconception that students that might be lower prior attaining or with SEND cannot work independently. And that falls into that camp of thinking, well, these students can't. Our job as teachers and leaders is to foster independence amongst all students. And often it's the students themselves that have internalized the belief that they cannot. When I've been most successful at this, my students have turned around and said, but miss, that was so easy. And then I've had to remind them that no, it wasn't easy. You've just become a really expert geographer. And when we equip students well, they naturally start to want to do things independently. So I think in an example of my toddler who was, when she learned to run or jump, she stopped remembering there was ever a time when she couldn't and saw it as the easiest thing in the world. But I knew as her parent how much she struggled to get there and the many months of difficult work that went into building those skills. So part of how we do this will come across in due course when I show the video excerpt, but there's also much we can do at the planning stage. The starting point is, again, the core knowledge. What's the core skill or competency or knowledge that you want students to master? And what's the task that's going to open up the opportunity for them to demonstrate it? And then maybe what's the scaffold or support that will then help them to master it? Sometimes that's a sentence starter or a vocab list, and at other times it's a completed version that they engage with first, an exemplar. But a lot of the time it comes from teacher modelling the skill to students first, and crucially, having taken the time to either script or draw out the model that they want to communicate. In my coaching visits to school, this is something I notice is a little underdone and is worth a bit more time. In an example I'll show you shortly, I demonstrate to students how to complete a choropleth map. For any non-geographers on the call, that's a map that uses a colour key to show data. In planning this, I thought, how do I demonstrate the steps that students need to complete this choropleth map? And I broke it down into really, really granular detail, including follow the arrow with your finger. Have a look at the 6 steps that I've selected on the board. It's really quite granular. And some of these things you might think are assumed. And you might also notice that maybe point 2, we'll come to in a minute, but I've given them a scaffold so they write the letter in next to the country so they can remember what colour to colour it in. So this is like extremely granular. I've written it all out in advance, and then I practice modelling it with my own version of the map under the visualizer. And I spend quite a while on this that we're going to come later to see in the video. And this is really crucial in helping students to master a skill so that they can work independently. Okay, we're going to move on to seeing some of this in practice in the video. Kate, this is a great time for me to pause if there are any questions or reflections.
Nothing so far.
Okay. So let's look at some examples in practice where it all builds together. This video I'm going to show you is from a lesson at an art school where I taught a Year 7 nurture group. Every student in this group has either EAL or SEND needs. Some students in this class at the time had a reading age of 5, and others had only been learning English for a couple of months. The upside is that they are incredibly spirited, as you will see, and keen to show what they can do. You'll also see that I'm very supported by a whole school approach to routines, both behavioural and for teaching and learning. And strong school leadership is a crucial foundation of enabling good teaching progress in any specific subject. And I really want to stress the importance of that. If you've got a notebook available, please jot down these 3 questions that I put on the slide because they'll disappear in a moment when I show the video. You then might want to make notes as you watch under the 3 questions. There are all 4 clips in total that we will have a look at today. Okay, so just a reminder that our 3 questions are, what's the teacher doing in the moment? What's the teacher maybe done in advance? And what's their positive impact on student learning? So I wanted to tell you that this clip begins after the teacher has explained a new concept about quality of life. And what I want you to be looking for is how the teacher creates a short task for students to embed what they have just learned. Okay, so in this first clip, the teacher in the moment has given a really clear, direct instruction of a short write-up task. They point to the scaffold on the board where there's a sentence starter and the word because to challenge themselves. They're given a really short amount of time, and they ask that this is done in silence so that the students have a chance to really reflect on what they have learned. There are key visuals on the board, and we have a pens up cue for students to start writing. In advance, the teacher's prepared the slide that has visuals, going back to this dual coding idea. So the ideas are really clear. Notice this really helps students if they don't, who are just gaining their English vocabulary. The font size is quite big, so all students can see it as well. And the slide is very uncluttered. There's just one thing they need to do. And this means that students are able to get writing straight away after a period of after the period of time where the teacher's really explained an idea. So they're going to nip it in the bud right away, and provides an opportunity for students to rehearse, what's just been taught. Sometimes we call this everybody writes. I'll go through the same process on the second clip that we're going to watch in a moment. Just to give you some context, this video, the purpose of it is to help, in this clip, the students are practicing new vocabulary that they need for their upcoming tasks, high, middle, and low income countries. And they're also going to practice knowing the different thresholds via a polling activity. And yeah, have a think about how the whole class is participating and how the teacher is making sure that everyone has mastered that vocabulary and the concept that those words represent. So in the moment, I've done this I say, you say technique, sometimes called choral response, for our three keywords, high, middle, and low income. This helps students to practice sounding out the most important vocab, and in our case, the use of acronyms as well. The teacher then does a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of check for understanding task. This ensures everyone can participate and the teacher can really see everyone's answer. The teacher went through multiple examples to be sure that the students had understood, and this gave them time to rehearse in a very low stakes environment. They didn't feel like they were being tested. They were kind of excited to contribute. I would argue the polling was maybe better in this instance than a cold call, as maybe in this particular class of students would struggle to follow the cold call. And there's sometimes something that I see on my school visits used a little bit too much is the cold call. And I think sometimes there are other options, for example, mini whiteboards or polling that will allow more to participate and the students to have a better kind of view of what's happening in the room, as well as everyone participating at the same time. Particularly with some students who might struggle to follow what other people are saying. So also note, I think this was an important moment in the video where the teacher changed their mind and turned a cold call question into a turn and talk moment. They said, actually, everybody, what do you think? And then repeated the question. And this gave everyone the opportunity to try and work out why the answer was a particular answer. The teacher then listened to that conversation and was able to summarize from it. And that's a good example of maybe responding in the moment to what the teacher felt was most useful. So in advance, the teacher had prepared their I say, you say, and decided on the highest leverage vocabulary for the lesson. The teacher had decided on the format of the check for understanding and the questions that they would ask. In terms of the impact, all students had a chance to practice the vocabulary. All students are clear on the three categories and what they mean. Everyone's participated, and the teacher can see very quickly which students are or are not confident on the key learning. And this is especially important for the high, middle, low income categories because it's a prerequisite to the upcoming task, which is the main task of the map that we'll come to explain. Okay, let's move on to the clip 3. This links back to what I said earlier when I had the steps and I was like, follow with your finger and write down the code. So this is what this looks like in practice. You'll see me model how to do the Choropleth map under the visualizer. So have a look about the precise kind of modeling that I'm using. I do a bit of stopping and starting. Why do I do that? And what am I asking students to do as I do the modeling? Here we go. Okay. So in this clip, the teacher goes through the model step by step using the visualizer. They followed the think aloud with a tell your partner the steps, not do I do, just tell the partner the steps to help them memorize them. And then the teacher gave the student one to do on their own with a very short amount of time, 10 seconds, and asked them to hold, or 20 seconds, and asked them to hold up their work. This gave the teacher an opportunity to really check if they'd got it or not. And then she asked them to do the next one on their own. Teacher was checking and maybe saw some got it, some didn't, picked up the student that had done the first step correctly and put that under the visualizer. And then walked it through again with them, realizing they maybe needed a little bit more help, maybe an example where they've done it together. This also asking a particular student for their work was enabled the teacher to show off what students had done well. And then the next example, they did more and more on their own. So this is an example of a faded scaffolding, we call it. In terms of preparing, well, we saw that preparation earlier. They've used the model under the visualizer. They've thought through the steps in a lot of detail, including like follow the line with your finger, like really granular. But this has really helped them all to understand it. And the impact is that students are really clear on what they need to do before they start working independently. It reduces the likelihood of misconceptions or getting stuck. And it also removes the modeling under the visualizer, removes the language barrier of instruction if the thing they are doing is visually modeled, particularly for skills. And then they're able to get on with the task a lot more kind of confidently on their own. Let's watch the last and final clip. At this point in the lesson, students are completing their task independently. They've mostly finished the map and are on to describing the map, referring to the names of countries and examples they can see in their map. Okay, so in this last clip, we can see that the teacher visited a wide range of students in the lesson. With the exemplars on their clipboard to help them, they're able to pinpoint exactly what they are looking for. And this actually helps reduce the cognitive load for the teacher so they can focus their energy on what students have done and how to support. The teacher then selects a piece of student work, which is largely correct, but has a bit of room for improvement. And the teacher models how student can check their own work and stamps the 3 steps. They've got to mention high-income country, they've got to mention their threshold, and they've got to mention the names of countries. And they ask another metacognition question on how do we know which countries they are? And one student answers, well, we know this from the map. So it just helps the teacher check that the students know what they're doing there as well. In advance, the teacher would have known what to look for example, the types of correct sentences, and had that on an exemplar on their clipboard. In some instances, they might have thought about what misconceptions might have come up. In this case, probably confusing the different income groups would have been the main ones. And the impact is all students have an extended period of time when they can work. All students had their work seen by the teacher, and students were able to work independently, and then later on with the show course, see success from within their own class, and it also creates a culture of error at the same time. So a nice sense of achievement for the student to have their work put up, but everyone knowing that they can achieve the same success. So there we are. You might want to see the results of what was produced in the lesson. So within the context of this nurture group, there's one of the higher attainers on the right, sorry, the first one, and slightly lower on the other side. What's exciting here is that in both cases, students have completed a correct map that you can see using the colours in the correct way. And students have also done freehand, their own writing using, there was a scaffold on the board, but completed their own writing of descriptions of what the map is showing using examples. And if we went back to the core knowledge that we saw at the beginning and our summary paragraph, by and large, students have achieved what's on the board here. It doesn't look like the same sort of work that you might see from non-SEN students or non-EAL students, but they have pretty much achieved the core knowledge. So that's a really successful lesson where they've mastered a skill and been able to interpret the map for themselves. So I think that's quite exciting. I'm going to move on and just talk through a frequently asked question. What about mixed ability classes? So this is a common question I'm asked, which is, well, what happens is all very well when you've got a nurture group, but what happens with SEN classes which are part of mixed ability classes, SEN students part of mixed ability classes? Would you teach differently? And my answer is, well, not very, no. Firstly, we need to go back to the principle of cognitive similarity. So that which we do to support SEN can support all of our students. So most of those techniques that we have seen today, I would still do with mixed ability classes. Call and response, the polling, the methodical modelling, careful intentional monitoring of the student work. If we're worried that some students might feel a bit silly or think they're a bit too grown up for it, it can often help to narrate the purpose of each technique. So when I first started to use call and response with Year 11, I might say, well, this might feel a bit strange to us at first, but the research tells us we remember more of what we say than what we read. So this is going to help us embed crucial vocabulary into our long-term memory, which will support us in our exams to achieve the highest grade. And then that gets their attention a little bit more. The next thing you might need to do, or you might notice, is that some tasks you saw in the video, sorry, I should add my animations here. The next thing you might have noticed in the video is that some tasks are naturally allowed for some variation by outcome. So in the summary task about quality of life right at the beginning of the video, I would expect some students to write a more complex sentence than others, articulating perhaps more nuance that they picked up in the discussion than other students. Equally, if I pose a question in a talk task that's accessible to all, For example, how do I know the answer was X? The level of sophistication in the verbal answer will be different amongst different students. And I might look for that or listen for that as I go around the room. And maybe I'll respond to those differences in response later as well. Our starting point has to be accessibility for all. So therefore we adapt up, not down. So in some cases, I may wish to add further challenge. So on the worksheet that we did for the Coropath map, I might add 2 further questions on the worksheet supporting students who are more higher ability to further analyse the map. Here is the additional data. Use the world map to add on these 5 countries onto your map independently using the world map. Or maybe I might say something like, describe the distribution of LIC countries. I would mark these as challenge and then take care to keep pace in the lesson. So I might say, okay, don't worry if you haven't done the challenge, everyone move on to section B, sort of knowing full well that there's certain students I don't need to do the challenge, I just need them to get started on section B. And my walking around the classroom will help me monitor this as well. Lastly, in my planning, I would go back to the core knowledge and that the whole today, mum, dad, today I learned paragraph. I would imagine the response of a higher achieving student in the class and write this out too. And this will guide me on how to steer the lesson for them and inform the other points I have spoken through that are on the board here. So I hope that answers the question a little bit about how we can start to think about mixed ability classes. Do post into the chat if you've got any reflections on that answer or any thoughts there. Kate, have we had any questions in so far?
Nothing so far. You must be doing such an
Everyone's
excellent
goody
job.
two-shoes today. Everyone's goody two-shoes. Okay, so let's summarize what we've looked at today, and we'll have time for a few questions at the end. So in today's webinar, we've explored the context for why we can offer support and explored the issue of SEND in geography, knowing it's part of a wider problem of gaps in attainment and pastoral care. But also there are specific issues of why this is so pressing in geography. We've then learned about the role of inclusion-first teaching based on principles of cognitive similarity and celebrating neurodivergence. We've explored inclusion-first design in geography. And lastly, we saw this inclusion-first approach in practice, looking at a Year 7 class, and how this marries together the kind of careful design and implementation elements and how they work together with responsive teaching. So in a nutshell, if we are clear on what we want students to know, we can plan for how we explain in an accessible way with visual aids and how we can support students to demonstrate this knowledge with independence. And then over time, we will enable all students to become expert geographers. Let's put this into practice. And before we go, maybe we can have a think about what actions we want to commit to. So this might be as simple as having an initial conversation with a colleague to share what you've learned, but also be bold and maybe considering your vision. How would you like inclusion-first teaching to ideally look in your school? So I'll leave those 3 questions up, and I'd be really delighted to hear if anyone would like to share any takeaways that they've got from today.
I think we're happy if people unmute, aren't we? And just ask
Also as well. Yeah, they're very welcome.
to write it in the chat. Yeah.
As long as we've enabled that function.
Oh, that's a step too far. I don't know the answer to that.
If you can't unmute, please just do post in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, if you're not posting in the chat, really do take time to write maybe a note for yourself of how you'd like to follow this up, because it's always good to really reflect on how we can put what we've learned into practice. So thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to hand over to, it's been great to talk through these ideas with you, and feel free to get, if you, some of you I know already, please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or reflections. I'd love to hear. And I'm going to hand over to Kate, who maybe is going to talk through our final slide.
Well, actually, we've got some questions in the chat now. So
we do. Hooray! Let's go back.
Will it be available by video to non-attendees? Yes, look out for an email from me tomorrow. I will be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow.
Kate, with a caveat that I can't put the video into a recording because of GDPR. I had permission to share it for training purposes, but I don't have permission for a recording. So we will provide some summary slides that summarize the video.
Yeah. Okay.
If you're interested in another training for other members of staff, we could talk about that as well.
Great. Next question. Following on from mixed ability classes, how do you balance MA students not jumping ahead during the instruction phase and completing the task because they are bored or already know what they need to do.
Yeah, so I think that's important. I think it's a careful balance, isn't it? I think with the modeling, we need to think carefully about how we model in a way that is kind of engaging. And I think there might be a point where we let certain students go and we hold other students back. So you might say to certain students, you just carry on, and then we might have like a small group of students who say, could I have your attention, please? And we're going to go through this again. So that's one option. I mean, the other side of it is just thinking about your economy of language in the first place. So if we've thought really carefully about the model, it should be engaging for all and it should be quite short, because we've thought really carefully about how to script it. So I think there are two sort of different angles you can think about there. What's really essential to push on? In general, this idea of not skipping ahead, I think it's this idea of building in that challenge for every task. So every task might have an additional challenge that students get on with. Equally, when you're doing exposition, you want to explain it accessibly first, but you can pose an additional question here and there, which might slightly fly over the heads of the LPAs in the room, but I think that's okay. Some of us might start to think about this question, and then you can start to sort of pose that question. And then you can kind of follow up that conversation as you go around the room. So I think there's sort of clever ways to kind of think about that. And the final point to that question would be the importance of school routines. So it's our job as the teacher to direct their attention. So we might ask for mastery booklets or textbooks to be closed at certain points, or books to be closed at certain point. We might ask for attention to be on the board. We might narrate what students are thinking about at the same time as well. So there's a few different things there, but I acknowledge that's a really big question and something that lots of teachers are thinking about.
Lovely. We have some more comments, but not questions, so I won't share them. But Hannah, you can have.
Okay, are there any that are worth reading out to the group,
I
or
don't think so. Just thank you. It was great, and some reflections, but you can read them after, Hannah. So
fabulous?
yeah.
Okay, Brill. Kate, I'll send back to you now for just to summarize our final slide.
Great. I haven't got a clue what I'm meant to say on this final slide. So
Do you want me to tell you your notes from
if
last
you would
year?
like more information, I'm guessing what I need to say. If you would like more information, there's some QR codes there. Like I said earlier, I will send out an email, a follow-up email tomorrow, just with the recording. And if you don't already have the wonderful Geography Mastery program, you can get back in touch with me and we can organise the time for a call, or I can send you some further information. So yeah, any more questions, feel free to just get in touch.
I'll just flag the program preview, which is where you can download a set of our resources to see what they're about, and that could provide some inspiration as well. And on the email, you can book a call with the lovely Kate to talk you through even more.
Wonderful. Okay. Maybe we'll say goodbye and thank you to everybody. If anybody wants to stay on because they wanted to ask a question privately, we'll stay on for the next couple of minutes. But thank you so much for coming.